So after the NBA draft, we got to hear from the Bulls front office in Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley and answering questions from the media about the draft, free agency, the offseason, and the season going forward. And we don't get to hear from the front office that often. In fact, they kind of went MIA during the season when the Bulls were playing like crap. And since there was so much to unpack and some of the things they said, their approach to the draft, upcoming contract extensions, impending free agency for their current players. So in this video, we're going to be discussing some of the key takeaways from that press conference and what it means for the Bulls going forward. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I put out a video earlier discussing the Bulls draft selection at number 35 overall in Julian Phillips, as well as their undrafted pickup. So I won't be addressing that here in this video, but if you missed it, I'll leave a link to it in the description as well as on the end screen of this video. But anyway, AK and Mark took questions from the media late last night after the conclusion of the draft, and it was interesting, a little depressing kind of. I mean, I don't know, I think, some of it is just AK's personality. You can tell he doesn't enjoy talking to the media, isn't comfortable in those situations, can be a little awkward at times, and I think with that stoic personality, it can come off a bit dry, unenthusiastic, and uninspiring. Like, really, that's been the case for the last 2 or 3 pressers, like we saw after the trade deadline, as well as in their end of season interviews. But either way, some highlights from this presser. Obviously, they were asked about the draft selection and picking up Julian Phillips at 35 overall, trading into the draft actually, because remember, the Bulls did not have a pick going into the night. They talked a lot about how they had their eye on him. An immense talent, McDonald's All-American, very athletic, great defender who can provide an impact right away on that end of the floor. And when asked about whether they should have focused on shooting if they were going to be trading into the draft, they emphasized that this was more about talent and drafting the best player available. AK did emphasize they were going to address their shooting in free agency. Whether or not they'll actually do that remains to be seen, given they have stated this before and haven't really done much to address the Bulls' shooting woes. You also have to consider the Bulls are going to be limited in actually addressing shooting in free agency because of the limited cap space they have and the ability to use the full mid-level exception, because it'll put them close to the luxury tax line, especially if they re-sign Vucevic, Coby, and Ayo, which they indicated in the presser that that was still their intention. They even confirmed that they will be extending qualifying offers to both Coby and Dosunmu, which would make them restricted free agents come July 1st, and the Bulls would have the ability to match any offer sheet that they receive from that point. But if they do re-sign all of those guys, they're going to be very close to the luxury tax line, which, as I've stated before, I'm sure you've all heard from reporters in the media saying it as well, the Bulls have only paid the luxury tax once in history. It's not something the Bulls' cheap owners are going to do. But the ironic thing about it was, when AK was specifically asked about having the ability to go into the luxury tax if needed, and having the blessing from ownership, he actually replied yes, which I'll believe that when I see it. He did say shortly before that, though, that it all depends on free agency, that the Reinsdorfs have always been open with him about going into the luxury tax if the team is competitive. He specifically said top 4 or top 6 in the East, which as of right now, the Bulls are not that. So that would indicate he wouldn't have the green light to go into the tax. But also, even in the past, when the Bulls have been kind of that team, meaning in the top 4 in the East, ownership still never paid the tax, so I'm going to call BS on that one. Now, another takeaway was when the front office was asked about the impending extension or free agency, should they not reach an extension, with Vucevic, and AK said it was a work in progress, working with Vuc's camp and coming up with a deal that makes sense for both sides. I don't know if it was just me, but AK didn't sound as confident or as enthusiastic as he did when addressing the media about this topic in mid-April. I know he's not the easiest guy to read, but there did seem to be a sense of uneasiness in terms of how those negotiations were going. Maybe I'm just reading into it too much, but I do still think Vuce ultimately will re-sign with the Bulls, but his demeanor when answering that question compared to his confidence before when talking about re-signing Vuce seemed to have taken a different tone. The other big piece that was addressed in the presser was, of course, status update on Lonzo Ball, and just as most of us already knew and expected, they did confirm that they're going to go into this season with the expectation that Lonzo Ball will not be available and will miss the entire season, which again, we all knew was going to be the case. But it's still such a hard pill to swallow when you always want there to be this sliver of hope that the rehab goes well and he comes back sooner than expected. But I think the front office knows and wants to be realistic, unlike last offseason when they were just kind of being vague in their responses that Lonzo Ball maybe coming back. He was making progress, was in reality not really making the progress that they would like to see. I'm glad that they just set that expectation from the beginning that he isn't going to be here this season. And when asked about whether or not they think he will ever play for the Bulls again, he did say that he will be back on the basketball court eventually, but he didn't say with the Bulls, which I thought was a little interesting. AK did also say that, a waive and stretch option of his contract is not on the table, but that they would meet to discuss whether they will apply for a disabled player exception. Another takeaway from the press conference, which this one kind of made you cringe a bit when he was asked about Vucevic and the trade now that has been fully completed with the Magic selecting Jet Howard at number 11 in the draft. And he said, "I think that transaction when we brought Vuce here showed everyone that we're trying to win." And then he talked about all the other players that came after that with the goal of trying to win now. But then the cringy quote, "I thought the deal worked out pretty well for us," which, look, I get it. You kind of have to save face at this point. It was your first big move as the new executive. It was a big swing, and honestly, it was working well until it didn't. With ball going down, teams starting to figure the Bulls out, the fit overall, and the flow of the offense not being the best, I just would have worded it differently, because that's not going to sit well with fans. It makes it look like you're out of touch and delusional to just shrug it off and say that the trade has worked out well for us. Obviously, he's not going to say it was a bad trade or I regret making that decision, but something to the effect of, yeah, we felt that it was the right move at the time, which, by the way, I still think it was. I know a lot of people will disagree with that, but at that time, it was. The Bulls were not good, and they needed to change. If they wanted to keep Lavine happy, they needed to be more aggressive and take a different approach in wanting to win now. And Bulls fans forget, they were all about that trade when it first happened. We were stoked to see the franchise finally acting like a big market and making strong plays at landing all-stars. But yeah, it didn't work. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it didn't go as planned. So saying something to the effect of, we felt that it was the right move at the time, and due to circumstances, some of which were out of their control, Lonzo Ball, it's put us in a position where we need to figure out how we go about getting better and making the necessary changes. Don't tell us the deal worked out well for us. Like, we know you don't even believe that. Don't try to sell us that. It's not going to go over well with fans and the confidence that we have in you. And then finally, I'll end with this as sort of the last big takeaway from the presser. The guys were asked about the disappointment and frustration from Bulls fans and how they feel about that. And AK responded quite candidly, and to be honest, it was the only time throughout the press conference where I felt he seemed confident in actually meaning what he said. He said, "We have a lot of work to do." He then added, speaking directly to the reporters, "You're obviously writing about how much work we need to do. People are telling me we need to get to it, so we will this week. We're going to address our stuff in free agency." I mean, they have said stuff like this before, and they didn't do anything, so I won't hold my breath in seeing what they actually do until it happens, but you'd have to hope they're going to take this seriously in truly improving this overall roster. And if they're not able to, the market just isn't good, or they can't make the trades they want, or they don't have the money to sign free agents they want, then you blow it up and rebuild. You can't just keep delaying the inevitable. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how things transpire next week when free agency begins June 30th in the evening, and see if the Bulls will actually be aggressive in their approach rather than doing a whole lot of nothing like the last 1.5 years. But anyway, those are my key takeaways from the press conference. Let me know what you guys thought of AK and Mark Eversley's remarks. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.